Good morning, good morning, good morning. Happy Father's Day. So if you define yourself as a father, please stand up. Define yourself as a father, please stand up. Give these guys and ladies a hand. Me too, I'm a father too. One of the ways in which I define myself is as a father. There are many other ways that I define myself, as I'm sure you do as well. And we're defined, my assertion for today is that one of the strongest ways in which we define ourselves is by the stories we tell ourselves and others about us. And so here's an example of that. How many here who have been here and listened to me talk before have defined me as somebody through listening to my stories who keeps not a risk taker, plays it safe, and stays in my comfort zone? Raise your hand if you have defined me in any way like that. Anybody? No. I don't define myself that either, and it's through the stories that you have gotten this idea that I do not fit into that category. Others might when you listen to their stories. And so there are lots of different types of stories. I'm going to talk about two types today. The first is the story that you tell yourself and others to explain why your life is limited, to explain why you haven't achieved everything you've achieved, and why your life doesn't look like how you dream of it looking. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had stories like that. And still, to this day, have to catch myself when I start telling a story that sort of sounds like that. The other type of story is the one where we are the hero of our own Odyssey adventure, right? Where we are divine, powerful, spiritual beings who rise up in the circumstances of the story we are telling to come out a better person, a better being, and having a better life because of it, thriving. And so what you want to do is take a look at which stories are you telling. Now, as I have said before, grief is really important. So if you have a loss, a disease, lack, and you are grieving that because it has just occurred, you may go and tell that story. This is what I'm struggling with right now. This is what has happened. This is what I'm going through. And then you may tell the story again. And then you may tell the story again. And again. And again. And years pass, and you're still telling the same story. And what happens at this point is you have literally frozen yourself in time, just like the woolly mammoth they found in a block of ice from 10,000 years ago, still having the same hair, the same organs. If that mammoth woke up, it wouldn't have thought it moved forward a day. And there's a part of ourselves that gets locked in when we keep telling the same story of whatever that loss, disease, lack is. I've told you guys the story of when I was diagnosed with a disease at a very young age. Many of you know that. And what I used to do is tell that story. It defined me. My disease absolutely defined me in my younger days. And I'd go and I told that story and I told that story. A decade passed, a second decade passed. I'm telling that story. I have this disease. I am struggling with this. I'm struggling with that. And sure enough, I did. Decade after decade after decade. Until finally, doctors say to me, you have 5 days to live. That changed the story. You might think that that would, right? And it changed the story so much that I noticed it actually changed my health. And I noticed that. I noticed that now I wasn't telling the same story, and the other thing that was happening was that my health was changing. And so what I came to realize is that either circumstances are creating your consciousness, or consciousness is creating your circumstances. Now, any of you who have been in science of mind a long time know that, wait a minute, our consciousness is always creating our circumstances. So if I was to say this properly, what I would say is that either the circumstances of our past are feeding our consciousness, which is then through our consciousness creating the next circumstances, or our consciousness, or we're being so aware of our consciousness and feeding it that new story that it needs to have to create what it is we want to have in our lives that then create our next circumstances. But that's very complicated to say. So it's much easier for me to remember by simply saying either my circumstances are creating my consciousness, or my consciousness is creating my circumstances. It's just easier to remember, to catch myself when I find myself telling a story that doesn't serve me to be telling. Because every time you tell it, that story of struggle, that story of loss, every single time you tell it, you are freezing that story in your consciousness in a way in which it's going to repeat. And so when I noticed that my health was changing as I was changing my story, I took a look at another piece, which is that at age 6, I started getting sick on my birthday every single year. I would get the flu, high fever, shakes, and it would go on for weeks, like about 2 weeks, for years, decades. And then it happened again in the spring, and then it happened again I'd get a cold in the summer that would go on for, almost the entire summer. And this was my story that I was telling to people. Oh, yeah, I'm always sick on my birthday. For my 30th birthday, my wife at the time talked about planning a surprise party, and I said, you might as well not. I'm always sick on my birthday. And sure enough, I was. And so when I started looking at how changing my story was changing my health around this disease I had, I started thinking, man, I really need to start changing my story around these symptoms I keep having around my birthday, and then again in the spring, and then again in the summer. And so I started, so the next time I had those symptoms of a fever and chills, instead of saying, I have the flu, I started saying, I have this amazing immune system that is getting out anything that doesn't belong in my body. I am healthy as a horse. My fever actually proves that, because that means my immune system is working. And so that's the new story I started telling. And then when other people might say, you have a cold, I would just say, it's just not passing through because my body wants it out. And when I had digestive issues, I'd say something along the lines of, well, it's moving very quickly out. And getting it out. And what I noticed is when I shifted how I was telling that story to myself or anyone who asked, I stopped saying I have the flu. I stopped saying I have a cold. I stopped labeling it. All of a sudden, it stopped happening. Not all of a sudden, over time. And then, so I get together with Ash, and she has these 2 young daughters, and they're catching everything in the book, and it's laying them out for a week to 2 weeks at a time, and either I'm not getting it at all, or I'm getting it for a day or 2. And that's it. And it's gone. And I'm thinking, this stuff really works. And so I started talking to Ash about that when we first met. And so because at the time, she's like, immediate symptom comes up, she's on the WebMD and looking it up and labeling it and finding out, well, it's got to be this or that. And I'm like, let's try it this other way and see if this shifts like it did for me. And so she started doing that. Started going, okay, No more labeling. It's not passing through. It's my immune system being great. I am healthy and strong. And holding that as her story, sharing that with herself, sharing that story with me. And then sure enough, when her kids got the big diseases or whatever, because they weren't interested in what we were talking about at all, Ash's started shrinking. She hasn't been sick in 3 years since we started doing this. And I noticed that something else went along with that as we were doing this. As we started shifting the story, that shifted our definition of I am sick to I am healthy, and this is a proof that my life, that my immune system must be very healthy because it's working so darn well to move out what needs to be moved out. I just started noticing how it did that for, how we could move that into each and every area of our lives. I started thinking about that more, how we are powerful, creative, spiritual beings. How we are a teaching of miracles, and yet constantly grab onto the conventional. Now, I am not saying don't go see a doctor. I am not saying, because doctors, medicine, all that stuff, that's God too. It's all part of the grand scheme of health. And so I am not up here saying don't do what you are moved to do, because that is your path to health. I am saying that when you move that way from a place of the divine, when you move, whether you go to take a pill, go to see a doctor, go to do whatever it is you're going to do it from a place of this is the divine happening through me, as opposed to this is what conventional medicine says. You could be taking the same action, but the story is completely different. And I don't think we as a teaching, we have the treatments, we have moments of when we get to that place of divinity, but on the day-to-day when things are moving along at a fast pace and something comes up, do you at that moment grab yourself and go, wait a minute, this is divine. There's God in this too. This is my moment to rise and be that powerful spiritual being I know I am, right here and now, right here in this, whatever this is. And that's a story that can feed you, feed your life. And what I notice is as Ash and I continually shift these stories, it's shifting our habits. We exercise more, we eat better. And we do that from a place of simply knowing ourselves as healthy and divine, as opposed to, oh man, I better eat better because I got high blood pressure, or I got this, or I got that. I need to do these things. What a different story to tell as to what motivates you to do things from a place of either struggle, where you're defining yourself as in that struggle, or from a place of this is divine too. This is miracles can happen right here too, and do all the time. I mean, that's one of the things that I've experienced most for myself in this teaching is the miraculousness that happens in my life, in my wife's life, in others' lives, that's possible, that somehow we because it's kind of embarrassing, the whole miracle thing. It's not conventional. It does so maybe you're one of the people who downplayed it a little bit instead of standing in it going, that's what this is about. Things can change in a heartbeat when we are that clear. What we embody manifests when we are that clear. So things can shift like that. One of the things I've done over the past decade is work with people who are terminally ill, who have been given a diagnosis of 6 months or less to live, with miraculous results. There's a gentleman who came to me, and And it became, and the first thing we work on is their stories. What are they telling themselves? What are they telling others? And as they are willing to shift that story, their health actually shifts every time. There's one gentleman who's been around for 5 years after being given a 6-month death sentence. This is what's possible simply from shifting our stories, simply from remembering the powerful, creative, spiritual beings that we are, instead of saying things. I had somebody in a foundations class once who called me up and said, I know I'm not supposed to say I'm sick, but I'm sick. And I thought to myself, wow, I'm not teaching this very well. I need to get better at sharing this so that she can understand that this is about her being healthy. This is about her rising. This is about her bringing forth that which is biggest and strongest in her, which is the universe. You know, we walk around either as drops in the ocean or as the entire ocean in a drop. And every thought, feeling we have is putting us into one of those categories in that moment, defining us by either thinking of ourselves as simply a drop in the ocean or the entire ocean in a drop. And you guys get to decide. I get to decide. This is what we get to bring forth when we are looking at the stories we are saying to ourselves and anyone. And one of the beautiful parts of this teaching is practitioners. Will all the practitioners in the room please stand up? Please stand if you're a practitioner. These are the folks who have studied to know the truth so that they can know it for you. So if you run into a situation where you can't know yourself as they stand, keep standing for a sec. Don't sit down yet. Don't sit down yet. If you can't know it for yourself, that you are the entire ocean in a drop, these are the folks who can know it for you. Seek them out. Because that's what they're trained to do, and that's what they can support you in knowing for yourself. Thank you. You can sit down now. This is what's possible in this teaching. This is the beauty and power and strength of what we have. This is miraculous stuff. And when we put it, and when we forget and let our circumstances create our consciousness, instead of our consciousness being conscious enough to create our circumstances, we are frozen ourselves or that part of ourselves in time. Don't do it. When you hear yourself telling a story that you've been telling longer than a year, and the ending still has you being in struggle, it's time for a new story. Now, if you are a person who thinks all I'm doing is telling the facts, all I'm doing is sharing the facts, this is what's going on, I'm here to tell you that that's not what's going on. There's more to it than that. Because in any given situation, there is a myriad of data that we cannot take in. We can't take in everything that's happening. So we take in the part we take in, we call it facts, and that's what we share. For instance, there's never a moment in which you are not a powerful, creative, spiritual being having a human experience where you have the power and presence of the universe to pull from, to rise above. That's happening in every single second, no matter what the other circumstances, the facts that you're sharing looks like. If that's not one of the facts that you're sharing, then you are defining yourself less than who you are. Drop in the ocean, the entire ocean in a drop. It's your call. So I have this buddy. His name's Terry. He likes to play music outside of Earth Fair. And some days I go and I bring a harmonic or something, and I'll sit down and play with him for a while. And one day, he just turns to me. This was just last week, actually. Just last week. He turns to me and out of nowhere starts telling me this story I'm about to share with you guys. He used to be a sound guy back in the day, far back in the day. And he's out on the road with this band, 3 women and a male drummer. And their music's very popular, so they're going around, they're playing all these clubs around the country. But they are miserable people. They treat each other horribly. They treat him horribly. He is having a terrible time out on the road. A friend of his calls up, who was the sound guy for a band you might have heard of, Leonard Skinner, and said, hey, our stage sound guy just left. I need you to drop what you're doing and get here so that you can be the stage sound guy for all these different coliseums we're playing around the world. I need you to leave today. And my buddy, one of the ways in which he defines himself is by his integrity. So he looked inside himself and said, I can't do that. I have an agreement to be with these people. Even though I'm hating being here, this is my integrity to stay and do this. So he passed on that gig with Leonard Skinner. The next day, the plane crashed that killed almost the entire band and his friend who he would have been sitting right next to. He looks at that for himself, and the story he tells himself is, integrity saved my life. Now that's a story worth telling. Integrity saved my life. So what I want you to do is I want you to look inside yourself and see what stories are you sharing. Are there stories that inspire you to be that entire ocean in a drop? Or are they stories that are limiting you to being just a drop in the ocean? You get to decide whether your circumstances are creating your consciousness or your consciousness is creating your circumstance. This is on you, on me, on each of us to take a look at, to do our best, to build ourselves up, to make sure that how we are defining ourselves and the stories we are sharing is something of magnificence. When we get here in the morning, for those of you who are here and know, we circle up and everybody shares a word. Everybody here shares a word that is their spiritual essence that they are bringing to the day. The story they are telling for themselves and for this room this day. Imagine doing that every day. Imagine taking that into each moment, each time you walk into a new room, having that story with you of the power of who you are. Not just here when we circle up, but taking it into every place you go. Bringing it in there, you fully defined as the powerful, creative, spiritual being you are. The one who knows magnificence, knows joy, knows inspiration, gratitude, love, spiritual growth, knows all these things right here and expresses it and brings it into each and every moment of your life. That's the power. That's the presence of the story we can tell about ourselves and about each person around us. And if at any point you're having difficulty with that, seek a practitioner. Let them help you with your story. Let them know that new story with you. Let us rise together as the powerful, creative, spiritual community we are. And let that magnificence that is us shine through, not just here, but throughout our lives. Thank you.